I grew up in the 60s and 70s. My dad was an Air Force veteran, Second World War. I had uncles and cousins, or second cousins, my dad's generation, who were all in the war, in the Navy, a lot of Air Force. And Vietnam was a constant presence on television every evening. And we got Life magazine and National Geographic and so on. And I was enthralled by Life's coverage of Vietnam. I mean, the great photographers that they had, the great journalists who wrote about the war. And it kind of inspired me to get into journalism. So I spent over 30 years, almost 35 years in daily news. Most of it with the Canadian Press, the Water Service, and that's why I went to Afghanistan. You know, a lot of people, a lot of journalists think that the pinnacle of their careers would be to be columnists or to cover major league sports or to cover the Supreme Court or Parliament. For me, it was to go to war. And I did go to Kosovo for a brief time. That was my baptism. And when 9/11 happened, I was the second Canadian press journalist to go to Afghanistan. The first one to set up a permanent base there for us. They were based in Kandahar at the time. I was there when the main force came in. Of course, JTF-2 had been in Afghanistan since at least December. I think it might have been November. And 3 PPCLI, 3rd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, came in February, along with Lord Streatham and his force, and 1 CER, the engineers. And I had a house and a staff, and I'll show you all of that later. We'll do the troops first. And in Kandahar, I had 2 Mujahideen guards, and Ahmed and anyway, they were great guys. Then there we go. So, sort of starting with last first here, and this is troops leaving Canada's first wartime combat assault since Korea. It's in on the side of a mountain called the Whale's Back, and I'll get into that in a minute. This was Lieutenant Colonel Pat Stogren, who was head of the 3 PPCLI. The battle group came under the command of 101st Airborne in Kandahar. I gotta say, these aren't my best pictures. My best pictures are from my second trip and my third trip. I wasn't as well equipped on this trip, and I resolved after this trip that I would bring my own equipment, not CPs. But this was on the tarmac as we prepared to go to the Whale. This was after the first major offensive of the war. Our snipers had been out with U.S. troops for 27 days straight. They set records on that deployment, and these guys were sent out to this mountain. It was on the west side of the valley, and on the east side were the Hindu Kush Mountains, huge mountains like the Rockies, and that's the Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters were escaping Afghanistan through this valley into those mountains. And so we landed. I was with 8 reconnaissance troops, a 6-man squad, and their captain and his radio man. And for a journalist, the best place to be, I always said after this, was with Recce, because they're first in, last out, or with the paratroopers, because they always get into the SHIT. So this was our landing. The night before this assault, it was a cleanup operation, really. there have been a lot of Taliban and Al-Qaeda positions on this Wales back that were causing a lot of problems for the Americans. And so we were first down the mountain, found a lot of unexploded ordnance, cluster bombs, bullets, and some major damage to what evidently were machine gun positions or mortar positions. And the guy in the front there, by the way, is a Canadian sniper. He's not with a team in this, and he's wearing, the snipers wore British sniper fatigues. They were specially crafted fatigues. So this is running. We didn't know what we were gonna encounter. The night before, I was handed a report that said there were 85 Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters on this hill. We were at about 8,700 feet at the top. We landed about halfway up. These guys were carrying over 100 pounds of gear. I was carrying probably 50 or 60. And it was a tough go. And once we reached the top, we spent the first night on where once we crested the mountain or the hill, we spent the first night on the crest and watched B-52 strikes in those mountains opposite us. And they were just ominous, most ominous thing I've ever seen in my life. J-dams and different ordnance that the explosions were huge. And you just wondered how anybody could have survived that. We got down to the, would have been the west end of the mountain, I guess. And I think the valley ran east-west. And there was this castle-like rock formation, and he's looking at it. And on the left side of it, down below, is a little bit, is a bunker. So they had a view across the valley to the east. And this guy is, he's a Canadian. There were no Canadians in the immediate area. The closest assault troops were American 10th Mountain Division guys, and they had just spent 3 months at sea level in Kuwait or someplace, and they came in pretty sick at 8,700 feet. They had just arrived like the day before, didn't have time to acclimatize or anything. Yeah. Afterward, there were medics flown in to take care of some of those guys. Anyway, they set up a fire base down to the left, and there were about 20 of them who gathered at the right. The fire base opened up with anti-tank weapons, those disposable, sort of like a bazooka. They fired a couple of those into the bunker, and then they just opened up. Meanwhile, I had set up we had a portable satellite thing. It was looked like a laptop, and the lid was the antenna, and it was perfect. It just pointed to the southwest. It got a good connection to Toronto, and I called him up and I said, roll the tape. And I had a radio man right next to me and the recce commander, and I gave a play-by-play as these 20 guys over on this side crossed that swale behind his head there and swarmed over that rock like ants.
Just say,
Yes.
did you use the word disposable?
Disposable weapons, yeah. They were actual.
What's that?
Well, they're preloaded. You fire one round and throw away the thing.
Sling them.
Yeah. So those guys, it was like I was familiar. It's growing up in Canada as a kid in the 60s and 70s. All you saw of the Second World War on television and in movies was American. And when I saw these guys swarming over that rock and shooting into what they call wormholes and throwing satchel charges in, all I could think of was Saipan, one of the Pacific Islands where the Japanese were holed up in caves. And that's exactly what it looked like. And I was listening on the radio, or I was kind of giving a play-by-play of this, and they were recording it in Toronto, and then I got them to throw me over to the print desk, and I dictated a story, which every time there was an explosion or a volley of machine gun fire, the editor in Toronto would say, "Are you okay?" or "I think you better go." And I kept telling, "No, it's okay. I'm behind a rock here. We had a perfect rock. It was flat on the top, and it was kind of behind that. I had everything set up in the rock. Had my radio guy right next to me, so I could hear what these guys were saying at the other end." And so I got all that done, and the American colonel showed up, and I looked at him and I said, "Can I go over there?" And he said, "Be my guest." So I went over with my camera, and that's the American fire team. And that's the Castle Rock at the bottom, and you can see in between. It's kind of I call it a swale, I don't know. This is our sniper team. So I went over there. I wanted the pictures, and we couldn't move pictures until I got back. There was nothing I could do on the mountain. We were up there for 5-6 days, and so it wasn't my priority at that particular time. But as I went over, I snapped a picture. Our snipers were watching the flanks, making sure nobody was coming up the backside of the cave. And I walked around, and here was a guy with his head blown off. And I wanted to get up there with the Americans. As I started to proceed up there, one of the Americans yelled out, "10-pound satchel charge, 1 minute." And I'll tell you, the 3-pound satchel charges that they were throwing in there were changing the shape of this rock. And I wasn't hanging around for a 10-pound satchel charge, so I sprinted back across at 8,700 feet. But then oxygen, just deprivation and everything. The guys were, "Come on, come on." And it did. That whole rock collapsed. And that was basically the end of the battle. And as they came back, I asked the Americans, were they shooting back? One guy said yes. The other guy said no. And I spoke to our guys, and I asked them, "What do you think?" This guy said, "I never thought it would come to this."
Yeah. I just to me. Talking. Good like me, please.
He said, "I never thought it would come to this." And, it's been a long time since our soldiers had been actually at war. Had been the equivalent in peacekeeping. But anyway, these are the guys that I was with. And that's the captain, Ryan Lieutenant right here. So southwest of the Kandahar airfield, where they were based, was what they call Turnak Farms, which was Osama bin Laden's training facility. And they were using it as a training facility. At this point, after that operation, I moved out to the base because I had moved out before the operation because they told me something's going to happen and you're going to want to be around. So I was sleeping in the what was the airport terminal. All the windows were blown out. And at this time, Al-Qaeda and Taliban guys were firing rockets into the bases. So we would get rocket attacks from time to time. I was on the phone one day inside the terminal when a whole bunch of windows got blown out, knocked me over, and it was an interesting time. And it was cold. At night it was cold. In the day it was hot. So this was at Tarnack Farms. Colonel Stogren. And this is where an American F-16 dropped a bomb on Canadian troops. Killed 4 guys, wounded 10. Then it was about a week after this or 2 weeks after this that happened. It was at night. On this day, a guy walked up to me and handed me one of those weapons and gave me a box full of rounds and said, have at it. Which I never turned that opportunity down, because when we got up on the whale, the guy came over and tried to hand me a handgun. And I said, I can't take it. Journalists can't carry weapons, because you carry a weapon, it doesn't just reflect on you, it reflects on all journalists, and it makes them targets. Not that we already worked. There was $250,000 price on our heads at this time. So I said no, and he said, okay. He said, if the time or if the things aren't go south, there'll be plenty of weapons available. So I always took the opportunity to fire weapons. And this day I was throwing grenades and firing weapons. And I believe this might be the firing line where the bomb hit. Yes. So this is second operation. In between, one day I was at my tent, which was right behind the hospital tent, and somebody came up to me and said 4 Americans had just been killed by a booby trap, 4 American engineers. He said Canadian medics have gone out to retrieve them. So I grabbed my camera and I wanted to get a picture of Canadian medics doing their job when they got back. I went out where I always went on the tarmac to take the pictures, and I got a picture of them bringing a guy back, the body back. Well, until that point, the Americans, the only pictures of American dead had been single coffin, flag draped coffins. The Americans were very sensitive to how things were depicted, what was seen, what wasn't seen. Vietnam experience was very fresh. Those pictures from Vietnam that were pretty graphic, and all those body bags with the boots sticking out at the bottom and so on. I got the picture, and I felt that he had to take me by the shoulder and said, come with me. Took me back into the public affairs office, which I always avoided, and said, sit right there. And he went to get the jag. And I was waiting, and I thought, I'm not giving up my picture. So I went back to my tent. I filed the picture, and 2 MPs showed up just after I filed the picture. Yeah. Took me up to their wing, and I was actually kicked off the base. And my buddy Garthy, who is a documentary filmmaker, he left with me, and we stayed in a little hotel in Kandahar. And that was the night that night was the night that the bomb dropped. So I came back to the base and walked through the gate with all my stuff. The American guards knew my face. They didn't know I'd been kicked out. Went in. Colonel Stover, I wanted to do an interview with Colonel Stover, and he came and did an interview with me. We sat down on a kind of a curb, and he had a Navy lieutenant on one side of me and the colonel on the other. And the Navy lieutenant kept interrupting. He was a public affairs officer. And he kept interrupting, tried to steer the conversation away from certain topics and stuff like that. But finally, Colonel Stover told him, get the hell out of here. And at the point at which he did that was he was actually Colonel Clyde. So he did, and he got a bit of a Kit Kat, and the colonel gave me a great story, great, emotional story, human story. And the next day, I sat in a tent, and all those guys' colleagues came through and told me about the guys, 2 guys. So I did a piece on that. So I ended up staying on the base, but I kept my house in Kandahar, and I had a cook. His name was, we called him Baba, and so a term of respect for an older gentleman beard, which is why I grew a white beard when I was in Afghanistan. It's automatic respect. So Baba, Garthy, they had green potatoes in Afghanistan, and Garthy taught Baba how to make French fries. And my fixer, we'd send him out, and he'd come back with kebabs. I said, just make sure they're well cooked. Because you see the meat markets there, and the flies are just all over everything, right? So we do that on weekends. We'd go in, and they got me to the troops got me to GPS. At the time, GPS was a fairly novel thing. Got me to GPS the house, so if anything happened, if there was constant rumors of it could be a major attack and this, that. So we'd spend the weekends there, and they'd come back and get in on operations. So this was an operation to see if they could find Osama bin Laden in Tora Bora. Tora Bora was his last known location before he was found and killed in Ahmedabad in Pakistan. And there was a cave complex there that when the B-52s dropped bombs on it, what they thought was a cave complex, smoke came out of the top of the mountain. And they thought this was evidence that there was some kind of network inside this valley. So the engineers went out and they were blasting because the cave entrance was covered by huge boulders and stuff. And so we went out there for a week. We were actually weathered into Bagram for at least a week, and it was a radio. I couldn't tell CP where I was or what I was doing in midday. So this was landing, and at the time there was a big controversy about our uniforms. That the combat gear that they were wearing was green, and they were fighting in a desert country. Well, virtually all of the allied Arab nations that were with us were wearing green.
Checker.
And when these uniforms got dusty and faded, they were in perfect camouflage in those mountains. The vegetation was just. The American helicopter pilots said that the U.S. uniforms just stood right out, especially at night, and they had trouble finding our guys. One thing I'll say, I'm not religious, but the first time I went on the whale on the first operation, there was a padre on the tarmac, and he was giving communion. So I went over and I said, Padre, I said, I'm able, can I take communion? I'm not real. I mean, I grew up Lord. He says, yeah. He says, I'm Episcopalian. It's the same thing. So I took communion. And one of the reasons I did it was because my knees were doing this involuntarily.
Yeah.
We expected to land on it fast is what we expected. I took communion and I was just fine. And at the time, I've been working quite a bit with Bill Stewart and Bill Boss. They were great Canadian press war correspondents during the Second World War. They landed on D-Day. And I was editor in the newsletter from the Canadian War Correspondents Association. I just thought about those guys. And I was ready for it. If I died out there, I died. With purpose. So this was right on the Pakistan border. And we were on the side of this mountain. And the cave complex was right down at the bottom of this in the ravine below where these guys are. And there were caves around, but what they began to realize was that there were no cave complexes that they could find into our barn. And you would actually, on the ground, and it was even worse in the air, you would look at something you would swear was a cave entrance, and it was just a shadow. You'd walk up, and you'd be like 10 feet away, and you realize there's no entrance there, it's a shadow. And they found caves. There's one of those disposable weapons right there on the guy's shoulder.
No, that's a Carl Gustav.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
You know, throw those away.
All right. This guy, this is what I'm talking about. He went in, that was about the size of the entrance to this cave, and he had to crawl in about 20 feet before it opened up. They had no idea what was in there. It could have been snakes, could have been Taliban, could have been anything. And this is him coming out. There was nothing in there. A lot of these caves up there in that region were used by sheep herders, goat herders. And so here are engineers trying to clear out this cave entrance. And this is where Gareth and I slept. And it was right above that. I used to get up every day and jam my head on a tree branch there. I don't know how many times I did it, but I had a great big, repeatedly, exact same spot. Everybody got a kick out of that. So I was on this side of the tree, and Gareth, you can see his mat on the other side of the tree. And we were under light discipline, and if you needed to see in the middle of the night, you used a red filter on your thing. So at about 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up to the sound of rustling, grunting. Opened my eyes, and I could see this flashing white light in the sky. And I looked over, and Gareth was standing there with this sleeping bag open, going through his sleeping bag with this light. And I said, Gareth, what's going on? He said, something bit me and it hurts like a son of a bitch. I said, what bit you, Gareth? He said, I don't know, why don't you come over here and have a look? So something bit him right on his butt. So I took a look, and by God, there were 2 marks in his butt. I said, geez, Gareth, I think you've been bitten by a snake. He said, get the doc, get the medic. I said, oh, Gareth, I don't know where the medic is. So I went down this fairly steep below here, and there were armed guys sleeping everywhere. I mean, we were in what at the time was unpolitically correct Indian country. And here I am, stepping on guys and stuff, and I finally asked somebody, where's the medic? And he pointed. I found the medic, and I said, something's big, Gareth. Can you come up and have a look at him? He said, I'm not going up there. bring him back again. So I had to go back up, fetch Dorothy, bring her back down. Turns out one of the marks was a freckle.
Also,
The other mark was a bite, and by the time the dog saw him, it was bigger than a golf ball. It was swollen right up like a golf ball. So, and we didn't know what it was, but the next morning we found a very colorful centipede next to his sickle truck sack. And that's, I think the thing they said about centipedes was the more colorful they are, the more venomous they are. This thing was bright orange and black. So these are engineers, and this is their stuff. It all arrived at our spot on the mountain. And their guard and I turned it into our dining room. But it was full of explosives, and I said to one of the guys, I said, "Are we safe here with this stuff?" He says, "Oh yeah, you just need a flash to set it off." And literally the moment that came out of his mouth, there was this gigantic flash of lightning. Scared the day twice. So that's Major Bob Ford. That's Garth on the left. Garth has probably been in more places with Canadian troops than any journalist in Canada, including Matthew Fisher. He's a documentary filmmaker, photographer, and he died a few years ago from something that he got in the jungle. They went into the jungles in Burma, I think it was, and found a Second World War Canadian airplane, and kind of got some kind of parasite that ate him from the inside out. So a lot of what the Canadians did was meetings with local leaders, and there was always a lot of curiosity around the fringes of these meetings, and a lot of old weapons, very old weapons.
and yet,
I was fascinated by some of them. There was Russian, Soviet PPs, SH, or whatever they call them.
But there's a bunch of number 4 rifles in there that we sent to the Mujahideen.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's. Yeah. This.
Yeah. So in later, as I say, this stuff is my first year in Afghanistan. I wasn't real happy with everything that I got in terms of pictures, but the second and third years I went, I spent a little more than a year in Afghanistan on 3 trips. The longest was 5.5 months. And I shot thousands of pictures. A bunch of them were lost in a hard drive crash. But if you go to my website, their address will be at the end of the video, and you can see Buzkashi and pictures from all the tours that I was backed.
the
The troops are amazing. I just the way they did things, they did them thoroughly and professionally. And there's a scene in Saving Private Ryan where they're stuck, and there's a machine gun nest above them, and he sticks the mirror on his bayonet, and that's what they were like. They were very businesslike, very. Even the American troops after that thing, when they came back, it was like they just played a soccer match or something. They were exhausted, and it was just like daily business, you know. And these guys were, I had nothing but admiration for them. There's ANA troops there. African National Army. And these were the Iltises. And it was actually the following year, I was with 3RCR, that an Iltis was driving along, 3 Iltises were driving along a dry river bed, and the first Iltis drove over 3 anti-tank mines. And they were the first 2 Canadians killed by enemy action. And after that, the Iltises were taken out of rotation, and they weren't allowed on anything but hard surfaces. And they were eventually, very quickly actually, replaced by the G-Wagons. But the thing about the Iltis was they're very vulnerable, and you go into these villages and there's people all around you. And they did have an incident where a guy jumped into with a explosive belt, jumped into an Iltis and blew it up. But the advantage of it too was the hearts and minds. Iltis is very low, and when you're in an Iltis, you're looking up at the people around you. And Afghans tend to be very hospitable, friendly people, until they're not. And they will come up and talk to you, or, they're curious. And the power dynamic was very good for hearts and minds.
Yeah.
They were up here and you were down there. And then I would go out on patrols after the band, and we were in the back of what would have been at Buffalo, or like a Buffalo, but like Bisons. And they were down there. It was a completely different dynamic. Wish the Americans would drive around and they'd have everything out the windows already.
Tight.
Kids everywhere. These are what patrols were like. And more hearts and minds doing stuff like, this was a school they were going to rebuild. Child soldiers. I think this kid actually was manning a checkpoint. So we came down the road and he actually stopped us, searched us, and everything. So this was my team.
What?
And this is Mike Fixer, Ahmed. This was Syed. Okay, his arm. But he was still. I never knew his name. Didn't know what he did until I got my first invoice. It was $200 a day. And it's paid me 200 months later rest. He would be, I'd come back from, when I was staying with Hunst, I'd come back from, a day with the troops, and he'd be stoned. He could spoken Hash all day. And I never knew what his role was until I got that first invoice, and it said he was the sweeper, which is, in Afghanistan, the dust is like talcum powder, like baby powder. It's insidious. It gets into everything. You put your camera gear in a Ziploc bag, and it'll come out covered. And so the guy on the right end is Bubba the cook. So Ahmed had amazing connections, which I'll show you in a minute. He had relatives in Afghanistan. He was living in Pakistan. I gathered
Thanks.
the vehicle and him and me got together in Quetta, the Afghan border, Pakistan, and we drove into Afghanistan through the mountains up this road. And a colleague of mine, a good friend from school, Peter Cheney, had gone up just a couple weeks before me, and he had described that road as it was like the four horsemen of the apocalypse were riding just ahead. There were vehicles, burned their vehicles all over the place, and craters in the road. So the night that I arrived, an old man showed up with him and Syed, and they were to be my guards. And Ahmed translated for me, and he explained how, as a 15-year-old, he was throwing Molotov cocktails at T-33 tanks, and or T-55s or whatever they were, the Russian, Soviet tanks. And he was there to vouch for them, to assure me that I was their priority and that I would be protected. And after he left, he sat me down and taught me how to take apart an AK-47 and put it back together. So each night I would come back, and the first thing I'd do was edit pictures and get them to the picture desk, and then I'd write my story. And that whole crew would all gather around me and watch me work. And what's his name there? Geez, I can't. He would be right next to him for a chair. And he would always fall asleep with this lime green blanket wrapped around him. Everybody else, through the course of the evening as I worked, which would be a few hours, would drift off, leave. He never left my side. And I always looked down, and his AK would be laying against my chair, pointed directly at my head. And I know it's not going to go off by itself, but it was still a little unnerving. I was picking it up and checking. It was always on full automatic. So I'd switch it to safety and put it back. And I'd always have to wake him up and send him off to bed. Yeah, that's the AK. Syed was very quiet, very earnest, serious kind of guy. He kept a little notebook, and not Syed, and he would write down the Pashtun word and the English word. And when I would call home at the time, he would want the phone. They're very aggressive and very, very macho guys. And he'd grab the phone, and he'd take the phone from me, and he'd say, "Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, I love you." And he'd hand me the phone. And he had the little book, had the little bunny rabbits on it, and it's just like so counterintuitive. That's Bubba. Much younger than he looks, or much older than, I don't know. The average age, life expectancy in Afghanistan at that time was 47, male life expectancy. There are 100 people a month were either killed or disabled by mines. So there were, I think at the time, Afghanistan had more landmines than any other country on earth. So that's him. Now, this is the interesting part. These are Taliban warlords. I didn't know it at the time, but some of the $200 a day I was paid to Ahmed was going to these guys. to ensure my safety. I met Bunch for me, and I always felt relatively safe in Canada. Until it was almost time to go home. And the gunshots in the streets that you'd hear every night, sort of, you know. And I remember driving to the base one day, and I looked at a guy in the street and just looked at me going like this, and he knew if he had the opportunity, he'd do it. And so these guys were very interesting characters, and the reason it was Ahmed's idea to do this, we had 2 luncheons with 2 different groups, and at the time I wanted to know, where the rockets that were hitting the base were coming from and what was going on. And so I ended up doing a story that, some guys had been left behind, and they had sectors that they were responsible for, some details about that, so there they are. That's the AK. Yeah, we actually went to one of the rocket sites. For what they had done was they dug holes in the ground, and they were firing the rockets out of holes in the ground. So they were incredibly inaccurate. I think only a few actually landed anywhere on the base. And this drainage ditch, or this irrigation ditch, they're all over the place, was there, and we had to get to the other side, so that was that. He caught me. And that's Eddie Adams. I just threw that in there because he's an inspiration. He shot the Saigon execution picture that people say helped end the war in Vietnam. Eddie Adams. That's at the end of the whale. And there's good focusing. Kimba. So any questions?
But that's still
You said that hi, I'm Ed here, and the other Ed number 2, Ed number 1's over on that side. Identifying the Americans and the Canadians. The Americans obviously had the sand-colored uniforms at the start, and we didn't. But didn't we switch over at one time?
Yeah, but we had our own. They were different than the Americans. There was that cat pattern, whatever that pattern was called. It was a digital kind of pattern. It was different than what the Americans were wearing. I thought they had an older style uniform.
But wouldn't that have made them more susceptible in the mountains? That, like you were saying, that the green seemed to, which
Yeah. Yes. But they, I don't know how much more mountain work they did in the succeeding years. I was midway through the second tour that I covered that they got the desert camp. And it was a little different than the American. It was a little bit darker. They not as reflective, I think. They said the Americans practically an actual glow. Keep that going. Some of those pilots. One of these things. Everything else, they find this.
Have you maintained relationships with some of the troops that you were?
Actually, yes, I have. And I spent 3 tours in Afghanistan. I did Kosovo, and I did about more than 10 years worth of disasters, including Swiss Air. I have PTSD.
yes.
I couldn't go back. And I always wanted to do something. And it felt like my job was unfinished. And so I did a project that was shown here at the museum on Wounded Warriors. It was called Wounded, where I talked to some of the guys that been with some of and that showed here for a couple of months in 2018, 2019. And that was touring the country it's encountering right now. And yes, I talk to him all the time. Not all the time, but every on a fairly regular basis, I talk to him. Yeah. And,
As a
yeah. Pardon me?
I was just wondering, you said you had PTSD. How does your newspaper or your news company take care of you?
They didn't. At the time, they had nothing set up. I saw a sports psychologist for a while, and this work that I did a lot of talks, and that helped want things out a little bit, just to talk about it. And it wasn't so much Afghanistan that did it. I guess that's the straw that broke the camel's back, but Swiss Air really, it came at the end of a long stretch. It had done a lot of disasters, including the Harrow crash of Leander, when 101st Airborne, 248 of this kind of died. And yeah, so I just felt like I needed to do something. And they wanted me to go back. I said, I can't. So since then, I guess I've since found out that my experience was kind of a case study for CP, the Canadian Press, and that they did set up a program later on.
Okay.
They hadn't undertaken to have a staffer in Afghanistan for the duration of the war, and they did, as long as Canadians were there. You know.
One more question. I know Louise is biting at
No, I'm not.
those people that you worked with, the Afghanis. Have we, as a Canadian government, managed to get them out?
You know what? Not any of those guys. One of them wants me to get him out. But the fixer that I hired in Kabul the following year, and he worked with our guys as long as they were there. He took his, I think I was paying them $50 US a day. And I had a driver and a fixer. And he took his money and went to China and got a medical degree. I would get emails from him with him and his classmates standing next to a cadaver and stuff like that, you know. And we all wrote letters and did stuff. We got him out. He's here. He's been here for 2 years, and I haven't sick of that.
That'll be difficult. Could it?
Yep.